The sun dipped low, casting long, purple shadows across the dusty village square. Amanda, luminous and radiant in her patterned indigo wrapper, laughed with a pure, bell-like sound that echoed the joy in her heart. She was engaged to Kwasi, the village chief's son, and the whole community spoke of their union as the perfect match, a blessing from the ancestors. Hidden behind the thick trunk of the great baobab tree, elder Amanda, Kwasi's mother, the chief's wife, watched the young couple. Her face, a roadmap of harsh lines and unyielding tradition, held no warmth. Only a cold, critical appraisal of the girl who was about to enter her esteemed compound. She had wanted a woman of higher lineage, a connection to a wealthier clan, and this girl, though beautiful, was simply an irritation she was forced to endure. Young Amanda felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, like a snake had slithered over her foot, despite the warm evening air. She turned her head sharply, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing that would explain the prickle of fear. Kwasi, oblivious, pulled her closer, whispering sweet promises of a life filled with love and many children. Later that night, the village diviner, Mme Zola, stopped young Amanda on the path to the river. Mme Zola's eyes, milky with age and sight, bored into the girl's soul. She warned her that the waters of marriage were not always sweet, and that the greatest danger would come from the woman who held the keys to her new home. Young Amanda dismissed the warning as the rambling of an old woman, choosing to believe only in the strength of her love for Kwasi. She held the silver bangle he had given her tight against her chest, her hope a shield against any potential darkness. She walked home, utterly unaware that her simple faith would soon be her undoing. The marriage ceremony was grand and loud, as befitting the chief's son. Young Amanda, adorned in layers of precious beads and a gleaming white cloth, looked like a goddess descending to earth. But beneath the smiles, a terrible anxiety twisted in her gut, fueled by the strained, disapproving silence of elder Amanda during the traditional blessing rites. As young Amanda stepped over the threshold into the chief's compound, she tripped slightly on a loose mat. Elder Amanda immediately spat on the ground and muttered a dark incantation about clumsy feet bringing bad luck to a noble house. Kwasi tried to soothe his bride, but the chief's wife's loud, venomous words stole all the sweetness from the moment. The very next morning, the maltreatment began. Young Amanda, the chief's new daughter-in-law, was immediately assigned the hardest, most humiliating tasks. She was forced to scrub the compound stones with only sand and water until her fingers bled, while her husband's other sisters and cousins sat idle and gossiped, enjoying the show. During meals, elder Amanda enforced a cruel ritual. Young Amanda was given the smallest portions of the worst food, often bones and scraps, after everyone else had eaten. Her protestations to Kwasi were met with his pained, but ultimately weak, plea for patience, telling her she must simply endure to earn his mother's respect. Weeks turned into months, and the vibrant light in young Amanda's eyes began to dim. The laughter was gone, replaced by a hollow, perpetually exhausted look. She was no longer the joyous girl of the baobab tree, but a shadow haunting the magnificent compound, shrinking under the relentless weight of her mother-in-law's malice. One evening, young Amanda found the courage to confront Kwasi again, her voice shaking with months of suppressed misery. She lifted her torn, calloused hands and begged him to intervene, to see the injustice she faced, and to be the protective husband he had promised to be. Kwasi, though he loved his wife, was trapped by the oppressive weight of filial duty and fear of his powerful mother. Elder Amanda was not just his parent, but the first lady of the compound, and her displeasure could ruin his standing in the village. He stammered, telling his wife that she must try harder to please his mother, effectively abandoning her. The next morning, Elder Amanda was enraged that her authority had been questioned. She cornered young Amanda while she was fetching water and, in a fit of cold fury, struck her hard across the face, the sound muffled by the dense bushes. She warned her never to breathe a word of the compound's business to her spineless son again. Young Amanda had no one to turn to. Her own mother, a kind but timid woman, lived in a distant village and feared the chief's family too much to intervene. The village women, seeing the chief's wife's clear intent, looked away, not wanting to draw the elder Amanda's venom upon themselves. Alone in the dark, young Amanda wept into her pillow, her body aching, her spirit broken. She wasn't praying for happiness anymore. She was praying for an end to the suffering, for a sign from the ancestors that her life was worth more than this endless, crushing despair. 3 seasons into her marriage, young Amanda discovered she was pregnant. A tiny spark of joy flared in the darkness. This, she believed, would be her salvation. A child, a grandchild for the chief, was a sacred gift that even Elder Amanda could not disregard. When young Amanda announced the news, Elder Amanda's reaction was chilling. There was no joy, only a flicker of possessiveness in her eyes. She stated that the child belonged to the lineage, not to the weak vessel carrying it, and intensified the workload to ensure the child was born strong and hardy, or so she claimed. The tasks became crueler. Despite her growing belly, young Amanda was made to carry huge gourds of water up the steep river path and to grind corn for hours under the sweltering noon sun. She felt agonizing pains, which she kept hidden, fearing that showing weakness would only bring worse treatment. Kwasi, for a brief period, showed his former tenderness. He would sneak her small, nourishing pieces of roasted meat or fruit, whispering apologies for his mother's nature. These fleeting moments of kindness only served to confuse young Amanda, making her hold onto the slim hope that their love was still alive beneath the abuse. One evening, Elder Amanda offered young Amanda a special, thick herbal drink, claiming it was an ancestral tonic for a strong pregnancy. Young Amanda drank it, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes, believing her mother-in-law was finally softening. However, the drink left a strange, metallic taste in her mouth, and she began to feel cold, sharp pains in her abdomen. The pains intensified until they were unbearable, tearing through young Amanda's body like claws. She lay on her mat, writhing and silently screaming, the metallic taste from the tonic still burning her throat. Kwasi was away on a hunting trip, and the compound was terrifyingly silent. Elder Amanda appeared in the doorway, holding a flickering oil lamp. Her face, half hidden in shadow, was impassive and cold. She watched young Amanda's suffering, offering no aid, only chilling words that the weak seed must be purged for the sake of the stronger lineage. The miscarriage was brutal and swift, a horrifying scene of agony and blood. Young Amanda felt the life she had carried, her only hope of freedom, slip away from her. The overwhelming physical pain was nothing compared to the complete shattering of her spirit. The following morning, Elder Amanda allowed no mourning. She commanded that the bad seed be quickly buried and forced young Amanda, frail and weak, back to work immediately. She claimed that idleness was a curse and a sign of weakness that she would not tolerate in her compound. As young Amanda dragged her broken body to the corn-grinding stone, something in her died, but something else, a terrible, cold resolve, was born. The tears had stopped. She looked at Elder Amanda, not with fear, but with a vacant, chilling stare. Her soul had been replaced by a kernel of pure, white-hot hatred. Young Amanda's health deteriorated rapidly after the loss. She developed a high, unrelenting fever and a racking cough that kept the entire compound awake. Elder Amanda refused to call the doctor, claiming it was simply the girl's weakness and unwillingness to work. When Kwasi returned, he was horrified by his wife's condition. He finally saw the skeletal figure she had become and was overwhelmed with guilt. He argued fiercely with his mother, the first time he had ever truly stood up to her, demanding she allow a doctor to treat his wife. Elder Amanda, fearing the doctor would reveal the maltreatment, relented, but secretly administered another potion to young Amanda. This one was thick, dark, and tasted of bitter earth. It made the fever worse, yet she promised Kwasi it was a powerful, traditional cure that would chase the evil spirits away. In her feverish state, young Amanda became hyper-aware. She overheard whispers from the servants and pieced together the knowledge that her mother-in-law was actively trying to hasten her demise, not save her. She realized the true depth of the betrayal and the toxic nature of the compound. Clutching Kwasi's hand, her voice barely a whisper, young Amanda made one final, desperate plea. She begged him to take her away, to leave the compound and start a life where she could simply be safe. Kwasi hesitated, looking from his wife's face to the wall where his father's ceremonial shields hung, symbolizing his duty. He did not answer. The fever spiked uncontrollably. Young Amanda's beautiful skin was now ashen, and her eyes, once sparkling, were dull and lifeless. The women of the compound gathered, sensing the end, their faces a mix of false piety and morbid curiosity. Elder Amanda stood at the foot of the mat, her arms crossed, a triumphant, subtle smirk playing on her lips. She had won. The lowborn girl who dared marry her son was finally being removed from her noble house by the ancestors themselves, or so she would tell the village. Word finally reached young Amanda's mother, who arrived at the compound, hysterical and distraught. Elder Amanda blocked her path, refusing her entry, claiming the girl was cursed and contagious. The mother's heartbreaking wail of grief was the last sound young Amanda heard from the outside world. As the last shallow breath left her body, young Amanda's dying thoughts were not of forgiveness, nor of love for her weak husband. They were a single, scorching oath to the ancestors. Her mother-in-law would not rest, she would not prosper, and her compound would know the meaning of true suffering. A cold wind, unnaturally sharp and smelling of rain, swept through the closed room, snuffing out the oil lamp. It was a wind that spoke not of peace, but of a soul being released violently, an unquiet spirit embarking on a mission of vengeance. Elder Amanda was insistent on a swift, simple burial, citing the contagious nature of the fever. The chief, saddened but trusting his wife's wisdom, agreed. Young Amanda was wrapped in a simple cloth, denied the honors of a chief's daughter-in-law, and prepared for the earth. Kwasi, numb with belated grief and a crushing weight of guilt, could not look at his wife's face. He knew, deep down, that he had failed her, choosing his comfort and standing over her life. He cried silent, bitter tears as they carried her simple bier to the burial grounds. The burial was conducted just before sunset, a rushed, unceremonious affair. As the first clumps of earth hit the simple wooden coffin, a distant clap of thunder echoed, though the sky was clear. The earth, it seemed, was reluctant to take her broken body. Elder Amanda performed a quick, dismissive ritual over the fresh grave, sprinkling dust and muttering words to bind the girl's spirit to the earth. However, as she turned to walk away, a small, black, perfectly smooth stone, a marker for an unfulfilled spirit, appeared inexplicably on top of the fresh mound of soil. Young Amanda's mother watched from a distance, barred from the main ceremony. She saw the black stone and felt a cold terror that was deeper than grief. She recognized the sign of a restless, angry spirit, a daughter whose suffering would not end simply because her body was gone. The first night after the burial, a profound, unnatural silence fell over the chief's compound. The usual sounds of crickets, distant drums, and the gentle chatter of the night were absent, replaced by a suffocating, heavy stillness. Elder Amanda was the only one who could not sleep. She lay on her mat, fully awake, feeling an unbearable pressure in the air. She heard faint sounds, a distant, phantom cough that sounded exactly like the one that plagued young Amanda, and the faint, rhythmic scraping of a grinding stone outside her door. Suddenly, a terrible crash shattered the silence. In the kitchen area, the huge, intricately carved clay pot used for storing the chief's wine had spontaneously split down the middle, spilling its contents. It was the pot that only young Amanda had been allowed to scrub clean. In his room, Kwasi awoke in a cold sweat. He had dreamed he was drowning, pulled under the water by hands with painfully torn, calloused palms. He sat up, gasping for breath, and looked toward his late wife's empty corner, convinced he saw a fleeting shadow of a woman watching him. Elder Amanda inspected the broken pot, her face tightening with a fear she would not admit. This was no coincidence. This was deliberate. She stood in the moonlit courtyard, whispering to the air, challenging the spirit. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the spirit of the girl refused to rest. The trouble continued into the daylight. The chief's most favored livestock, a prize bull and a plump goat, were found inexplicably sick, weak, and unable to stand. They were covered in strange, dry lesions that no doctor could identify, like a sudden drought had struck their skin. Elder Amanda, known for her powerful home remedies and knowledge of herbs, mixed several potent concoctions, but they did nothing. The livestock refused the medicine and grew weaker. Her reputation as a knowledgeable woman of the compound began to suffer among the servants. That afternoon, the chief's personal garden, the most fertile patch of soil in the village, tended by young Amanda until her death, was suddenly and completely withered. Every yam vine and pumpkin shoot was brown, dry, and dead, as if scorched by a terrible heat. The villagers, seeing the strange occurrences in the powerful compound, began to whisper. They recalled the kindness of young Amanda and the notorious cruelty of elder Amanda. The word vengeance began to circulate in hushed tones, fear and awe mingling on their faces. Elder Amanda looked upon the dead garden, a cold rage mixed with genuine fear in her eyes. The spirit was not just restless, it was targeting her power and her prestige. She gripped her hands into tight fists, realizing that the battle for control of her compound had just shifted from the world of the living to the far more terrifying realm of the dead. Elder Amanda, now stripped of her usual composure, marched to the hut of Mma Zola, the village diviner, her expensive wrapper dragging through the dust. She did not request, but demanded, that the old woman perform rites to chain young Amanda's disruptive spirit back to the grave. Her voice was harsh, still ringing with the authority she felt she was owed, even though the spirits had clearly rejected her. Mma Zola sat cross-legged amidst her sacred cowrie shells and gourds, her eyes, milky with age and prophetic sight, fixing on the chief's wife with unyielding severity. The diviner revealed that she saw no curse, no malice from a demon, but a soul seeking righteous justice. She stated that the ancestors themselves had sanctioned this haunting, recognizing the depth of the betrayal young Amanda suffered while alive. The old woman explained that her power derived from the consent of the ancestors, and she could not, interfere with their judgment. She told Elder Amanda that the only path to peace was not through fighting, but through confession and true reparations made to young Amanda's grieving mother. This counsel struck Elder Amanda as a humiliation worse than any haunting. Elder Amanda's face twisted in fury. Her pride, the very vice that destroyed young Amanda, prevented her from accepting the diviner's truth. She spat on the ground, calling Mma Zola a weak fool, and refused to beg forgiveness from a woman whose daughter she had reduced to dust. She vowed aloud that she would find a darker power that did not bow to the ancestors' fickle morality. Leaving the diviner's hut, Elder Amanda felt a chill in her heart deeper than the river's current. She knew she was stepping onto a path of no return, where the laws of man and the ancestors held no sway. Her desperation solidified into a dangerous resolve. She would fight the spirit with darker magic, determined to preserve her authority at any cost, regardless of the destruction. Elder Amanda traveled far, seeking out a notorious blacksmith of the hills, a man known to work with iron and ancient, forgotten curses. This village was dusty and silent, filled with a palpable sense of dread. The blacksmith, a huge, imposing figure with charcoal-stained skin and eyes that glowed like embers, greeted her with silent, knowing malice. Elder Amanda explained her predicament, carefully omitting her own guilt and claiming she was battling a malicious family demon. The blacksmith listened, scraping his hardened thumb over a piece of cold iron. He agreed to forge a powerful iron stake, specifically designed to bind an unquiet spirit to the earth and silence its cries. The blacksmith then named his price, which was not coin or livestock, but a symbol of the lineage, Kwasi's ancestral gold locket, a heavy, intricately engraved piece passed down through the chief's line. Elder Amanda hesitated for a moment, the gold representing the very family she sought to protect, but the need to silence the spirit was greater than sentiment. With trembling hands, Elder Amanda produced the locket, the sacrifice of visible confirmation of her descent into desperation. The blacksmith took it, melting it down in his fiery forge right before her eyes, symbolizing the destruction of the family's heritage in exchange for a temporary fix. He warned her, his voice like grinding stone, that iron could contain a spirit, but it could not remove its cause. Elder Amanda left the forge with the sharp, black iron stake wrapped in rough cloth. Despite the blacksmith's cryptic warning, she felt a dangerous surge of confidence. She now held a physical weapon against a spiritual foe, believing she had finally found a way to re-establish her power and bury the girl's terrible truth forever. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Elder Amanda and a frail, terrified house servant crept through the bushes to young Amanda's hastily prepared grave. The small mound of dirt looked pathetic and simple, but the black stone marker placed there by the spirit seemed to pulse with cold energy in the dark. Elder Amanda began the ritual prescribed by the blacksmith. chanting the dark words that bound iron to the earth, determined to ensnare the spirit. She raised the sharp iron stake high above her head, its shadow long and distorted under the faint starlight, preparing to drive it through the marker and into the ground. Just as she brought the stake down, the air ripped apart with a sound like a woman's terrible, raw scream, a sound young Amanda's cough often muffled. A powerful, unseen force struck the servant, who collapsed instantly, unconscious and bleeding from the nose. The iron stake was wrenched violently from Elder Amanda's grasp. The stake flew through the air, landing far off, twisted and bent like a twig, proving physical force was useless against the spirit's will. Elder Amanda was slammed backward, hitting the earth hard, her old bones protesting. She saw a flicker of pale light, like heat rising from the ground, near the black stone. Shaken and utterly defeated, Elder Amanda scrambled backward, crawling away on her hands and knees from the grave. She left the broken iron and the unconscious servant, fleeing the place with a primal, desperate fear. She realized that by attempting to bind the spirit, she had only enraged it further, turning its sorrowful haunting into an active, vengeful war. Kwasi continued to be plagued by violent nightmares, but they had changed. He no longer dreamt of his wedding or simple sorrow, but of being dragged underwater by his wife's hands, their palms torn and calloused from the endless scrubbing she was forced to do. The nightmares were now explicit accusations of his cowardice. Unable to bear the guilt and terror alone, Kwasi sought out his cousin, a kind and respected man who lived on the edge of the village. He confessed the entire truth, his mother's cruelty, the forced chores, the miscarriage, and his own shameful silence in the face of his wife's death. He wept openly, a man broken by regret. His cousin, horrified by the tale of matricidal evil, advised Kwasi to flee immediately, to abandon the cursed compound and his wicked mother before the vengeance took him, too. He argued that the chief's house was too poisoned to save, and only escape could preserve Kwasi's soul and name. Kwasi listened, finding a brief surge of resolve. He returned to the empty compound and began to pack a small satchel, determined to leave his heritage and his haunting behind. He felt a moment of hope, imagining a life free from his mother's influence and the weight of his own guilt. As he tied the satchel, the room filled with the faint, spectral sound of young Amanda's soft, plaintive weeping. It sounded so real, so heartbroken, that Kwasi froze. He realized the truth. He could leave the physical compound, but he could never escape the spirit until he fulfilled his duty and ensured her justice. He slowly unpacked the satchel, accepting his fate. Young Amanda's aging mother, spurred by MMA Zola's quiet advice, made the arduous journey back to the chief's village. She did not approach the compound with anger, but with unwavering, sorrowful love. She brought with her only a small mat and a pouch of sweet grains. She set up a small, temporary shrine directly outside the chief's grand compound gates, placing a small calabash of fresh water and lighting a tiny oil lamp. This was a direct, peaceful act of remembrance and reverence, a visible challenge to the compound's claim that young Amanda was forgotten. Elder Amanda, raging inside the gates, saw this vigil as the ultimate public shame, confirming the village whispers about her evil. She ordered the remaining, frightened house guards to chase the grieving woman away, to tear down her pathetic little shrine. The moment the guards approached the shrine, they were struck by a sudden wave of nausea and agonizing headaches, forcing them to retreat quickly, clutching their temples. They dared not approach the place where young Amanda's mother sat, protected by an unseen, powerful maternal energy. Young Amanda's mother remained, a lonely, dignified figure. She was the village's silent witness, a beacon of love and uncorrupted truth positioned directly against the cursed house. Her presence ensured that the spirit's vengeance was recognized as just, not just a random haunting. The vengeance escalated from physical disturbances to psychological warfare. The massive, thick mud walls of the chief's compound began to whisper. It was faint at first, then distinct. Young Amanda's name and fragments of her suffering, like "the stones hurt" or "I am hungry." Elder Amanda was most tormented. She heard her own cruel, dismissive words echoed back to her, distorted into menacing sounds. Phrases like, "Go back to work, you lazy girl," or "You are worthless," seemed to reverberate through the empty halls, amplifying her guilt and fear. The chief, confined to his mat and weakened by a strange spiritual malaise, heard the frightening echoes too. He called for his wife and demanded a full explanation for the disturbing noises, his voice strained with fear and suspicion. He looked at his wife with dawning horror. Elder Amanda, though terrified, clung to her final shield of denial. She lied, claiming the whispers were a sickness brought on by a rival clan's curse, aimed at weakening the chief's heart. She begged him to hold fast to his pride and ignore the ravings of the village gossips. The chief, loyal but deeply troubled, found himself trapped. He stood by his wife, unwilling to believe the mother of his son was capable of such wickedness, yet unable to deny the terrifying sounds. His refusal to acknowledge the truth, however, sealed his fate and invited the spirit's wider, systemic justice. The focus of the haunting shifted subtly but powerfully. The chief began to experience strange, paralyzing fits. He would collapse suddenly, unable to move or speak, his body weak and unresponsive. The village healer could find no physical cause. It was a pure spiritual drain. Elder Amanda was seized by a new, more profound terror. She realized the spirit was now targeting the head of the house, the symbol of her status and power. If the chief died under these circumstances, her influence and position in the village would vanish entirely. She nursed him relentlessly, forcing herbal remedies down his throat, desperate to save him. But this was not an act of love. It was a frantic attempt to preserve her standing. Her desperate touch only seemed to worsen his spiritual malaise, as the spirit recognized the false nature of her ministrations. Kwasi watched his father's rapid, incomprehensible decline, his face etched with silent pain. He finally understood the scope of the spirit's vengeance. It wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoer, but about dismantling the entire system of power that enabled the cruelty. Kwasi felt the net tightening around the compound. He knew the spirit was closing in, seeking not just personal revenge, but total, institutional justice. The chief's sickness was the final, devastating proof that no one, not even the most powerful, was safe from the consequences of the wickedness that flourished under that roof. Elder Amanda needed specialized, rare medicinal herbs for the chief. She ventured into the bustling village market, determined to buy the ingredients necessary to fight his unseen illness. She approached the herb seller, trying to project her old air of authority and demand attention. As she opened her mouth to speak, to bargain and command, no sound emerged. She tried again, forcing air from her lungs, but only a raspy, painful wheeze escaped. Her voice, the instrument of her pride and cruelty, had been taken from her. She tried desperately to write her request on a piece of slate, but her hands began to shake violently, scattering the charcoal dust. The market women, initially concerned, soon realized what had happened. They whispered, their faces grave, recognizing the justice. The spirit had silenced the scornful tongue that condemned young Amanda. Unable to communicate, humiliated and defeated, Elder Amanda stumbled back home, leaving the required herbs unbought. The sight of the once powerful chief's wife silenced and defeated sent a powerful message throughout the village. Her power was gone. Back in the empty, silent compound, Elder Amanda clutched her throat, tears of impotent rage stinging her eyes. She now lacked the basic ability to communicate and command. Her physical self was failing, and the spirit was systematically removing every tool she had ever used to inflict pain and maintain control. While a heavy, nourishing rain fell on the rest of the village, bringing life to the crops, the chief's compound remained inexplicably dry. The sky directly above the great house was clear and punishingly sunny. This selective drought was nature's condemnation of the injustice within. The compound's deep wells, famed for their clear, abundant water, ran suddenly and inexplicably dry. Any river water brought in by the few remaining servants evaporated with unnatural speed. The vast courtyard became cracked and dusty, mimicking the cracked earth of young Amanda's dried-out heart. The few remaining secondary wives and servants, weary of the haunting and the lack of basic necessities, saw this as the final sign. They could no longer live in a house rejected by both the ancestors and the very elements. They packed their meager belongings in the middle of the night and fled the compound. Elder Amanda and Kwasi woke to a profound, sickening silence, the silence of utter abandonment. They were left alone to tend the dying chief, surrounded by the decaying grandeur of their home. The grand compound, once a symbol of prestige, now looked like a magnificent, haunted tomb. Elder Amanda stood in the deserted courtyard, looking out at the massive gates, her figure frail and diminished against the huge, silent architecture. She had achieved complete control of the compound, but at the cost of its destruction. She was now absolutely alone, utterly isolated, facing the spirit's justice with no one left to command. Desperate for a flicker of her old identity, Elder Amanda went to her chamber, seeking the highly polished, heavy bronze mirror she once used to admire her ceremonial robes and jewelry. She needed to look into her reflection and recall the powerful woman she once was. As she held the mirror up to her face, gazing into her own haunted, wrinkled eyes, a sudden, sharp cracking sound filled the room. A large, jagged fissure spontaneously appeared on the surface of the bronze, running directly across the reflection of her face. The crack widened quickly, and for a terrifying second, Elder Amanda did not see her face, but the pale, sorrowful, accusatory eyes of young Amanda staring back at her from the fractured image. It was a clear message. Her image and her pride were broken forever. With a silent, choked gasp of terror, Elder Amanda hurled the mirror across the room. It shattered into 100 pieces on the hard earthen floor, its destruction symbolizing the final fragmentation of her sanity and authority. She crumpled to the ground, weeping dry, soundless sobs. She realized the spirit was not just outside the compound, but inside her mind and soul. She could not hide from the truth, even in her own reflection. The vengeance was now total, leaving her only with the cold, constant awareness of her own wickedness, preparing the stage for the final, devastating acts. The chief lay upon his mat, his powerful frame wasted by the mysterious spiritual ailment, his breathing shallow and rattling. For a terrifying, brief moment, the fever and the curse seemed to lift, and he looked at his son, Kwasi, with startling clarity. He spoke, his voice thin as dry grass, asking what terrible fate had befallen their noble house to bring such ruin and shame. Kwasi, guided by the cold, compelling force of young Amanda's lingering presence, knew this was his final duty. He knelt beside his father and spoke the unvarnished, brutal truth. He recounted Elder Amanda's relentless cruelty, the forced miscarriage, and his own cowardly complicity in allowing his wife to die in misery. The words were quiet, but carried the shattering weight of years of concealed wickedness. The chief listened, his eyes widening in horror and disbelief. The revelation of his wife's wickedness and his son's weakness was a spiritual blow more devastating than the illness itself. He tried to rise, summoning the final dregs of his strength and authority to pronounce a final, binding judgment upon his wife, to save the lineage from total moral decay. The effort was too great. Before he could speak the damning words of judgment, his breath caught, and he died. His last, heartbreaking gesture was not a collapse, but a rigid, final extension of his arm, his hand pointing an unmistakable, accusatory finger directly toward Elder Amanda, who stood frozen in the doorway, witnessing the entire scene. Elder Amanda watched her husband die, his final act being a public denouncement of her life. She realized that the spirit had ensured she lost not just her husband, but his respect and protection in his very last breath. The victory of truth, delivered by her own son, was more painful than any physical curse. The chief's funeral, which should have been a grand celebration of a long life and powerful reign, was a study in chaos and disgrace. Every attempt to honor him was met with spiritual sabotage. The costly white ceremonial cloth laid over his body was found mysteriously shredded to ribbons moments before the procession was to begin. The designated funeral drummers found their ancient instruments useless. The skins of the drums were inexplicably torn and loose, refusing to yield a single, resonant note of mourning or praise. The elders, sensing the pervasive spiritual taint, feared to touch the body, refusing to carry it. Elder Amanda, ignoring the spiritual signs, tried to seize control, her silenced tongue forcing her to use frantic, desperate gestures. As she attempted to lead a rite of purification, an unseen hand seemed to scatter dirt and ash directly onto her white ceremonial robes, defiling the symbol of her status. The funeral ended as a rushed, embarrassed affair. The final rites were incomplete and hollow, a clear signal to the wider region that the chief's house was not only cursed but morally bankrupt. The public disgrace was the spirit's method of stripping the family of its honor, layer by devastating layer. Kwasi stood numbly watching the shameful spectacle, realizing that his family's long reign and reputation had been buried alongside his father. The chief's death, coupled with the disgrace of the funeral, brought the grand era of their lineage to a final, disastrous end, proving the spirit's vengeance was complete and total. Fearing the spirit's escalating wrath might engulf the entire village, the Council of Elders convened an urgent, solemn session to pass final judgment. Elder Amanda and Kwasi were forced to stand before them, the focus of the community's terror and shame. MMA Zola, the diviner, was called upon, and her cowrie shells confirmed the truth Kwasi had confessed. The maltreatment and murder of young Amanda was the cause of the curse. The elders used a sacred artifact, a protective mask, which Kwasi was forced to wear, and it began to weep thick, black, sorrowful tears, signifying the true victim. The verdict was undeniable. The elders pronounced Elder Amanda guilty of causing the death of a lineage bride, and, through her pride and malice, of destroying the chief's house and lineage. Her crimes were deemed not against man, but against the sacred order of the ancestors. The punishment was swift and devastating. Elder Amanda was formally stripped of all her titles, her authority, and her very right to belong to the chief's family. Kwasi was assigned a solitary penance, to remain in the cursed compound as a witness to the truth and a guardian of the shame. Elder Amanda stood before the council, her silence amplified by the enormity of the judgment. Her face, once a mask of fierce pride, was now a mask of utter defeat. The spirit had used the very traditions and authority Elder Amanda sought to protect to deliver the final, irrevocable blow to her standing. Following the pronouncement, the elders immediately carried out the public stripping of Elder Amanda's status. One by one, they removed her ceremonial robes, the layers of precious beads, and the heavy, bronze anklets that symbolized her rank as the chief's wife. With each item removed, Elder Amanda visibly shrank, the garments that had defined her power now hanging limp and useless in the elder's hands. She was reduced from the powerful First Lady to a ragged, frail old woman in a simple, stained wrapper. The most painful sentence followed. Elder Amanda was exiled from the village forever. She was ordered to leave the compound and the community immediately, never to return, forfeiting any right to her past life or possessions. Elder Amanda turned to Kwasi, her eyes pleading desperately for her son to defy the judgment, to help her escape. Kwasi, his gaze steady and cold, simply shook his head. He repeated the elder's decree, telling his mother that she must face the consequences of her actions alone. Elder Amanda was forcibly escorted out of the compound gates, taking nothing but the shame and the silence that clung to her. As she passed through the entrance, she saw the empty space where her powerful ceremonial seat once stood. Her life, her power, and her legacy had been entirely revoked. Elder Amanda began her lonely, terrifying journey into exile. She walked along the dusty path she once traveled in a carriage, now alone, stumbling, and stripped of all protection. The hot sun beat down on her head, unyielding, mirroring the heat of the curse. As she left the village boundaries, she passed young Amanda's mother, who was still sitting by the gate, maintaining her vigil. The two women made eye contact, not a glance of hatred, but a shared moment of profound, desolate sorrow. The grieving mother saw not a monster, but a broken, defeated woman. Elder Amanda attempted to find refuge in a neighboring village, hoping her former influence might hold some sway. But word of the curse and her wickedness had traveled faster than she did. Doors were shut in her face. She was denied food, water, and shelter by fearful villagers. She was forced to sleep in the wild, under the open, cold sky, her old body aching from the damp earth. This forced humility was a precise inversion of the comfort she had denied young Amanda. The spirits of the forest seemed to reject her touch, and no peace could be found. Back in the compound, Kwasi began his lonely penance. He started the slow, agonizing process of dismantling the symbols of his mother's pride, beginning with the ceremonial seat and the decorative shields. He was now the solitary warden of a magnificent, empty prison. Kwasi eventually located his exiled mother, not to rescue her, but to set up a small, isolated hut of penance for her far from the village. This was not a place of comfort, but a controlled prison where the spirit's justice could be meted out without her immediate death. The life she now lived was a meticulous inversion of the cruelty she inflicted. She was given only scraps of dried food and a meager portion of water, exactly mirroring the starvation she forced upon young Amanda. Her strong, manipulative hands were forced into continuous, back-breaking labor to survive. Young Amanda's spirit, no longer chaotic, began to manifest as a visible, but hazy, figure that was seen only by elder Amanda. It stood silently in the corner of the hut, or just outside the door, merely observing her suffering, mimicking the cold, passive surveillance she once inflicted. The chilling passive observation drove elder Amanda faster toward madness than any active curse. She began to scream at the silent form, begging it to fight, to scream, to do anything but simply watch. She started talking to the spirit, confessing her sins in a desperate, pleading whisper, seeking an end to the haunting. Kwasi visited her daily, ensuring she remained alive to continue her suffering, offering no words of comfort, only a profound, silent judgment. Elder Amanda had achieved perfect isolation, consumed by the spirit's quiet, unrelenting demand for acknowledgement and remorse. Driven to the edge of sanity by the spirit's ceaseless presence, Elder Amanda stumbled away from her hut and made her way toward the riverbank, the place where young Amanda had nearly collapsed under the burden of heavy gourds. She was seeking oblivion, an end to the torturous existence. She stared into the dark, flowing water, and the surface reflected not her old, haggard face, but the image of young Amanda on her wedding day, vibrant, beautiful, and utterly pure. This vision of the beauty she destroyed was more potent than any curse. The sight shattered the last vestiges of elder Amanda's pride. She broke down, a torrent of genuine, agonized tears finally streaming down her face, tears that were soundless but overwhelming. She realized the full scope of the priceless love she had sacrificed for her own hateful ego. She prepared to throw herself into the dark water, believing that only death could reunite her with the peace she had destroyed. She stretched out her frail arms, ready to embrace the river's cold finality, finally submitting to the spirit's power. Just as she leaned into the current, a shadow appeared. The spirit's intent was not her death, it was her full, conscious acknowledgement of the truth. Kwasi, driven by a strange intuition that was now intertwined with the spirit's will, arrived just in time to stop her. Kwasi pulled his mother back from the surging water, his strength fueled not by love, but by the need to complete the spirit's justice. Elder Amanda struggled weakly, confused by this final act of interference. Kwasi looked his mother in the eyes and, for the first time, spoke with the unadorned authority of a man who had faced his failures. He told her she could not die yet. Death was too easy a reprieve. She must live to fully acknowledge her sin to the ancestors and to young Amanda's mother. Elder Amanda collapsed, her will broken. She saw her son not as a rescuer, but as a cruel, spiritual warden, a tool of the vengeance designed to keep her in her living hell until the final atonement was made. Kwasi returned her to the hut, his face grim but possessing a new, unnerving calm. He had accepted his role as the keeper of the truth, ensuring his mother remained alive to complete the spirit's demands. Later that night, Kwasi, sitting alone, received the final, powerful message from his wife's spirit. The spirit demanded that the truth be permanently memorialized and the memory of the lost child be properly honored before she could rest. Kwasi sought out young Amanda's mother, who still maintained her silent vigil near the village gate. He told her of elder Amanda's fate, her exile, and the spirit's final demands for a proper memorial. Young Amanda's mother listened, her grief softened by the passage of years and the certainty of justice. She felt a profound, bittersweet solace in the knowledge that her daughter's spirit was finally leading the cleansing of the chief's house. The grieving mother reached into her small pouch and produced a tiny, intricately carved wooden bead that young Amanda had worn as a child. She gave it to Kwasi, asking him to place it deep in the foundation of the new memorial. This act was a form of forgiveness, not of the wrongdoer, but of the man who was broken by the wrong. It was a step toward a final, cathartic peace, acknowledging that Kwasi's penance had earned him the right to finally honor his wife. The two victims of elder Amanda's wickedness, the husband and the mother, stood together, finding a quiet, mutual understanding. The emotional tension shifted from relentless rage to a solemn promise of healing and remembrance. Kwasi began the difficult, solitary work of building the memorial at young Amanda's grave. He worked with his bare hands, using stones gathered from the old compound. Every piece of stone was a symbol of the dismantling of his mother's oppressive power. The labor was hard and unending, but Kwasi found a supernatural strength in the task. He was working not to build a structure, but to rebuild his own soul. The silent, calming presence of his wife's spirit seemed to fill the area, guiding his hands. He carved the small, simple, black stone marker that first appeared on the grave, etching into it symbols of fertility and a broken heart, honoring the lost child and the suffering mother. The memorial was simple and honest, a perfect contrast to the deceitful grandeur of the compound. With tears streaming down his face, Kwasi placed the small wooden bead from young Amanda's mother deep into the memorial's foundation, sealing the commitment of truth and reconciliation with the last memory of his wife's purity. The memorial stood, small but powerful, a physical testament to the spirit's victory. Kwasi knew the final step was at hand, the full, public acknowledgement of the truth by the wicked woman who caused it all. He was ready to bring elder Amanda to the site of her final atonement. In her isolated hut, amidst the scraps and the dirt, elder Amanda received a final, devastating spiritual vision. She saw the magnificent ancestral lineage tree of the chief's house, which had been the source of all her pride and maneuvering, suddenly wither and burn to ash before her eyes. The fire was cold and silent, consuming the roots of her family's name entirely. The vision was a truth she could no longer deny. Her relentless efforts to protect the family's honor and status did not preserve the lineage, but utterly destroyed the very legacy she sought to uphold. She realized the spirit's vengeance was so precise because it targeted the foundation of her own wickedness, her overwhelming, destructive pride. She collapsed onto the earthen floor, the cold weight of the realization crushing her will. The tears that finally escaped her eyes were not of physical pain, but of profound, desolate loss for the monumental ruin she had inflicted upon her own bloodline. She was left with nothing, no power, no home, and no future for her family. In a dry, cracking whisper that finally broke her silence, she spoke her truth to the surrounding emptiness. She admitted that she was not the victim of a curse, but the architect of her own destruction. She cried out, "I destroyed us all. I was wicked," her voice carrying the terrible sound of absolute defeat. This complete, conscious acknowledgement of her sin was the spirit's final requirement before the physical act of atonement could begin. Her spirit, finally cleansed of its pride, was ready for the last, painful journey to the grave site. She lay still, waiting for Kwasi, her final warden, to arrive and lead her to the site of resolution. Kwasi arrived at the hut, his face grim but possessing the authority of a man acting on divine command. He told his mother the memorial was complete and that the ancestors demanded she must acknowledge it and confess at the site before her death. The time for her final penance had arrived. Elder Amanda was far too weak to walk. Her long exile and starvation had left her frail and near death. Kwasi carefully lifted her slight, wasted body and placed her upon his back, beginning the arduous journey. This physical act symbolized the son carrying the entire weight of his mother's sins, a profound reversal of roles. Kwasi walked the long, dusty path to the memorial site, his own body aching under the burden. The journey was slow and agonizing, mirroring the painful, suffering walk young Amanda was forced to make carrying the heavy water gourds in her late pregnancy. Every step was a tearful, physical penance for both the living and the dying. As they traveled, Elder Amanda rested her head on her son's shoulder. Her eyes, now clear and calm, looked out at the world she once dominated. She saw the village not with arrogance, but with a simple, broken clarity, realizing what true, simple human connection and love she had sacrificed for cold, empty power. Finally, Kwasi reached the lonely site. He carefully set his mother down before the small, unadorned memorial. She looked upon the simple grave and the carved black stone, seeing not a curse, but the final, undeniable truth of the injustice she had wrought. Kwasi stood beside his mother, and across the grave, young Amanda's mother was waiting, a solitary figure and the final, most important witness. The small assembly was a complete reversal of the grand, dishonest gatherings Elder Amanda once orchestrated. This was simple, pure, and honest. Elder Amanda looked at the small memorial stone, then at the grieving mother, and finally began her confession. Her voice was barely a rasp, but the words were distinct, carrying the full weight of years of concealed wickedness. She started by admitting her overwhelming pride and jealousy. She detailed the cruelty she inflicted, the deliberate stripping of the girl's dignity, and finally, the terrible truth of the forced miscarriage of her own grandchild. She apologized not just to the spirit, but to the mother, acknowledging the profound, permanent pain she had caused to the innocent. She finished by begging for forgiveness, not from man, but from the ancestors and the spirit of the wronged girl. It was a raw, agonizing plea delivered by a woman completely stripped of every pretense and defense. It was a final, tearful, cathartic release for the narrative's tension. Young Amanda's mother, tears silently streaming down her face, nodded her head once, a small, solemn gesture of acknowledgement. She offered no words of absolution, but her silent presence confirmed that the debt had been paid and the truth had been spoken. As Elder Amanda finished her final words of apology and confession, a profound, immediate change swept over the site. A soft, warm light seemed to emanate from the memorial stone, enveloping the grave in a gentle glow. The air, which had been thick and heavy with spiritual tension for years, suddenly felt light and clean. A gentle breeze rustled the nearby dry leaves, carrying away the oppressive, cold weight that had clung to the area since young Amanda's death. The curse was formally lifted. The silent, constant spiritual presence that had haunted Kwasi and driven Elder Amanda to madness departed entirely. It was a serene, final moment of resolution, signifying that the vengeance was complete and the spirit's demand for truth had been met. Elder Amanda's face, etched with a lifetime of anger and fear, finally relaxed into a look of profound, quiet peace. She had been released from the burden of her own wickedness, a state of grace she had spent her life denying others. She closed her eyes, and without a sound, she passed away right there at the foot of the memorial. Her final resting place, though temporary, was the site of her truth, her body finally finding rest after fulfilling the spirit's requirement for a complete and honest atonement. Elder Amanda's body was quietly and quickly buried in the small, lonely plot near her hut of exile. There was no grandeur, no ritual, and no mourning from the chief's family. Only the silence of justice completed. Kwasi oversaw the burial, his face stern and grief-stricken, but resolute. He recognized the necessity of his mother's fate, and his attendance was a final, cold act of obeying the spiritual law. He placed a single, small stone on her grave, a sign of her simple, final resting place. The burial was far from the chief's sacred plot, confirming her permanent stripping of rank even in death. This physical separation symbolized the spirit's final verdict. Elder Amanda's actions had severed her from the noble lineage she cherished. Kwasi then returned to his wife's memorial. He stood between the two graves, his wife's honest memorial and his mother's simple mound. He made a silent promise to guard the truth he had confessed and to live a life worthy of the second chance his wife's spirit had granted him. The final burial marked the end of the chief's family as the village knew it. Kwasi was now utterly alone, the last of his line, but finally free from the curse and the crushing weight of lies. The focus of the community shifted entirely from fear to humble healing. Kwasi returned to the grand compound, which remained empty and quiet. He chose not to abandon the home entirely, but to live there as its solitary custodian and witness. He began the hard, slow work of tending the scorched, cracked earth. In the center of the dusty courtyard, Kwasi planted a new, small baobab sapling Getty images, a symbol of the village's resilience and new growth. He watered it daily from his own meager supplies, his devotion to the small tree a metaphor for his commitment to nurture the truth. Kwasi dedicated the last of his family's wealth not to his own comfort, but to helping the poor and rebuilding the small parts of the village his mother's pride had damaged. He began a quiet life of moral service, recognizing his true debt to the community. The baobab tree became known as the Tree of Truth, a living monument to the spiritual cleansing. Kwasi's daily ritual of tending it symbolized the hard, constant work of atonement. His life was now fully devoted to honoring his wife's final demand for justice and moral honesty. Kwasi was no longer seen as the chief's son or the coward, but as the repentant man, the keeper of the truth. He carried the scars of the tragedy, but his quiet, humble service earned him a new, simple respect from the villagers. The curse was officially over. The wells in the chief's compound, which had run mysteriously dry, filled again with clear, cool water. The harsh, punishing heat that haunted the property lifted, replaced by the gentle, life-giving air of the surrounding village. The house, which once felt like a tomb, began to slowly heal. Small patches of grass grew in the cracks, and the sounds of normal life returned. The chirping of crickets and the nesting of birds in the eaves. The spirit's cleansing had restored the natural order. Kwasi, in a final act of reconciliation, invited young Amanda's mother to use a healed section of the great garden. The two worked silently side by side, tending the soil, the shared labor bridging the gap between them and healing the memory of past pain. The magnificent compound remained, but its meaning was utterly changed. It was clean, spare, and quiet, no longer a symbol of power and deceit, but a hollow shrine to the profound remorse of its last living resident. The land itself had found peace, proving that the vengeance was not spiteful, but surgical and necessary. The spiritual equilibrium was restored, and the tragic fate of the family was now a finalized chapter in the village's history. The tragic, dramatic events of the chief's house became the most important folktale in the village. It was not a private shame, but a public lesson, told around the fires at night and whispered by the market women. The story was told to young brides as a severe warning about the sanctity of marriage and the sin of pride. It ensured that young Amanda's memory was one of a powerful, avenging force, not just a helpless victim. The narrative focus was always on the emotional truth. The ancestors protect the innocent, and the power of a single, wronged soul is greater than any earthly authority. The tale offered both catharsis and moral certainty to the listeners. The memorial became a place of frequent visit and offerings, ensuring that young Amanda's name and suffering would never be forgotten or dismissed. The memory itself was institutionalized into the village's collective conscience. The folktale served as the final stage of the spirit's vengeance, ensuring that elder Amanda's wickedness would be eternally remembered, and the truth of young Amanda's love and suffering would endure forever. Decades passed quietly. Kwasi, now a venerable old man, lived out his quiet penance in the large, serene compound. He had fulfilled his duties, and his life was one of peaceful, profound melancholy. The baobab tree he planted was now massive, casting a great, cool shadow over the courtyard. Kwasi spent his days sitting beneath its shade, talking softly to its roots, sharing the memories of the wife he failed and the truth he guarded. He never remarried, dedicating his life to the memory of the love he could not protect. His chosen solitude was the final, quiet confirmation of his lifelong penance, the ultimate cost of his youthful cowardice. Kwasi was regarded with deep respect by the villagers. His face, though lined, carried a serene look, the peace of a soul that had wrestled with its failures and found its way back to honor and truth. His redemption was complete. Feeling the familiar pull of the earth, Kwasi knew his time was near. He prepared for his final journey with a quiet acceptance, his life's mission fulfilled. He was ready to join the spirit he had so desperately failed, and then so meticulously served. One warm afternoon, a small child, a grandchild of one of the servants who had fled the compound years ago, cautiously approached the old man. The child, clutching a flower, asked Kwasi about the small, simple memorial stone and the beautiful Amanda it honored. Kwasi, his voice soft and raspy with age, told the child the entire story, detailing the vibrant love, the crushing cruelty, and the terrible, righteous justice. He held nothing back, recounting the pain and the ultimate peace. He used the tale not to terrify, but to teach the child the value of kindness, the sacred nature of speaking the truth, and the destructive power of pride. He emphasized that only acknowledgement of sin could bring true rest. The child listened in rapt, solemn awe, carrying the flower like a sacred artifact. This simple exchange ensured that the story would pass organically to the next generation, becoming a living part of their heritage. Kwasi watched the child walk away, clutching the flower and the truth. He had guarded the memory, completed the atonement, and secured the legacy of his wife's spirit. His final, great work was complete, readying him for his last, final rest. Kwasi was now an extremely old man, his body frail but his mind sharp, having lived decades as the solemn guardian of the truth. He felt the familiar pull of the earth, a deep, quiet certainty that his time of penance and service was finally drawing to a close. His last thoughts were not of fear, but of the long-awaited peace had earned. Summoning the last of his strength, Kwasi took his cane and walked the short distance from the compound to the memorial site, the place where his life's journey of guilt and atonement had climaxed. The baobab tree Getty images he had planted long ago now towered above him, its shade deep and comforting. He sat down by the simple, enduring memorial stone, touching the cool, smooth surface with a trembling hand. He whispered a final, tearful apology to young Amanda, thanking her spirit for not letting him die a coward, but for forcing him to live a life of truth and honor. He apologized for his weakness, not out of pain, but out of gratitude. He closed his eyes, his final image the vision of the thriving baobab and the small, clean memorial. He had lived out the terms of his penance fully and with grace. He knew that the balance had been restored, and his soul was finally ready to be free of the earthly compound sorrow. Kwasi passed away peacefully, his head resting against the stone that marked his wife and child. His death was not a tragedy, but a gentle, deserved final rest, a conclusion to the long, difficult process of redemption and spiritual justice that had defined his entire life. Kwasi's burial was attended by every member of the village and many from the surrounding areas. It was not a grand funeral for a chief's son, but a humble, crowded ceremony for a man who had earned the community's deepest, most quiet respect. In accordance with his lifelong penance, Kwasi was buried in the same quiet plot as his wife and child, his final resting place next to the woman he had failed, and then spent his life honoring. This act fulfilled his final vow and closed the book on the family's tragic legacy. The villagers paid tribute not to the power he inherited, but to the moral courage he demonstrated throughout his penance. His life became a testament to the fact that even the most grievous sins can be atoned for through humility and relentless service. Kwasi's story joined young Amanda's in the village's collection of moral tales, serving as a vital lesson in redemption and responsibility. He was remembered not as a failure, but as the man who chose truth over pride, guiding his lineage toward an honorable end. The burial site, with its 3 simple mounds and the prominent memorial stone, became a single, unified monument to love, cruelty, and the ultimate triumph of justice. The physical presence of the graves secured the truth for all time. The scene shifts to a serene, beautiful afterlife, bathed in warm, soft light. This is the spiritual plane where the souls of the ancestors reside, a place of absolute truth and peace. The soul of Kwasi appears, tentative and full of relief. Young Amanda's spirit, no longer driven by vengeance or sorrow, appears before him. Her form is radiant and whole, her eyes sparkling with the luminous joy he had not seen since before their marriage. All traces of the bitterness and pain of her final years are gone. They embrace, not with passion, but with a deep, spiritual acceptance. The moment is utterly tearful and cathartic, a final release of all the sorrow and guilt that had defined their earthly separation. Their love, purified by his penance and her justice, is restored. The spirit of their lost child, the seed that fell, is also there, a symbol of the future that was stolen but is now restored in the spiritual realm. Kwasi looks upon the child, fulfilling the promise to honor the lost one, finding final peace in the completeness of his family. The spirits stand together in eternal harmony, demonstrating that the vengeance was not spiteful, but a necessary act of moral correction to secure a lasting peace. Their story concludes not in death, but in a transcendent, loving reunion. The magnificent, once cursed compound, now empty of its owners, was repurposed by the village elders. They decided that its great walls and structures should serve the entire community rather than a single, proud family. The massive house was converted into a communal granary and a community hall. This transformation was symbolic. The The place where elder Amanda had starved her daughter-in-law and hoarded wealth now housed the village's collective nourishment and shared future. This final act ensured the spirit's systemic justice was complete. The power structure that enabled the cruelty was permanently dismantled and repurposed for communal good. The house's physical form remained, but its meaning was entirely reversed. The beautiful courtyard, once a place of solitary pain, was now filled with communal activity and laughter. The place where young Amanda was tormented now serves as a center of village life and shared happiness. The baobab tree Kwasi planted grew immense, its huge, sheltering branches covering the courtyard. It became known as the Tree of Truth, a massive, living monument to the spiritual cleansing and the triumph of humility over pride. The memorial site to young Amanda and the lost child remained the most respected and visited place in the village, even decades later. It was revered not as a grave, but as a place of moral instruction and spiritual power. The village instituted a yearly ritual at the memorial, honoring the wife who found justice. This ceremony served as a communal vow against cruelty, ensuring that the moral lesson of the story was passed down through practice, not just words. The small, black stone marker, the first sign of the restless spirit, was polished smooth by time and generations of reverent touch. It became a simple, perfect symbol of enduring truth and the unstoppable force of justice. Young Amanda's mother, before her own peaceful passing, had tended the site faithfully for decades. Her spirit, like Kwasi's, was now interwoven with the memorial, forever acting as a guardian of the memory and the truth. The memorial stood as an eternal, quiet rebuke to pride, selfishness, and the abuse of power. It ensured that young Amanda's life, though tragic, had ultimately resulted in a profound, positive moral transformation of the entire community. The folktale of the two Amandas became the village's primary moral compass. It defined what was right and wrong, reminding everyone that earthly power is fragile, but the moral order of the ancestors is absolute and inescapable. The story was particularly effective against arrogance and cruelty. Any act of unkindness or injustice was met with the simple reminder, remember the fate of the chief's wife. The fear of spiritual vengeance ensured communal harmony. To those who suffered, the story offered profound comfort and hope. It taught that justice, though sometimes delayed, is guaranteed, and that even the weakest individual can wield the greatest spiritual power if they are morally wronged. The events of the tragedy were woven into the very identity of the people, influencing their traditions and customs. The village was now known for its humility and deep respect for the sanctity of life and marriage. The ultimate lesson was clear. The spirit's vengeance was not just punishment. It was a spiritual correction that cleansed the house and secured the community's moral future, a necessary violence for a greater peace. The story's narrator, speaking over images of the peaceful village, reflects on the ultimate takeaway of the tale. The voice emphasizes that the most powerful force in the world is not the authority of a chief or the wealth of a compound, but the righteous anger of a single, wronged soul. The narrator explains that the spirit's vengeance was not chaotic, but surgical. It precisely targeted the sources of elder Amanda's power, her voice, her rank, her home, and her pride. The punishment was meticulously measured to fit the sin. The emotional core is confirmed. The viewer's tears were not just for the suffering, but for the satisfaction of seeing perfect, proportional justice delivered. The story provided a deep, emotional release that transcends simple revenge. The narrator acknowledges the terrible cost of the cleansing, the loss of life, and the destruction of a great lineage, but justifies it as a necessary step toward the community's moral salvation and long-term peace. The tale concludes with a final declaration of moral certainty, that to escape the judgment of the spirit world, one must live a life of unyielding kindness and truth in the mortal world. The baobab tree planted by Kwasi is now a colossal landmark, its great trunk a silent record of the years of peace. Its massive shade covers the communal granary, symbolizing the shelter of truth over the former place of deceit. Children play beneath its sprawling branches, climbing its ancient, gnarled limbs. They grow up with the story of the spirit and the tree, understanding that the roots of their peace are embedded in the painful truth of the past. The tree is a living monument, more powerful than any stone structure. Its enduring presence constantly reminds the villagers of the fragility of life and the permanence of spiritual justice. It stands for Kwasi's endurance and young Amanda's ultimate victory. It is the final, grand symbol that the land itself has been reclaimed and healed by the forces of the ancestor spirits. The quiet authority of the tree governs the compound, a peaceful reign that replaced the arrogant authority of the chief's family, securing the village's humility for future generations. The camera takes a final, high, sweeping shot of the entire village, nestled beneath the hills, peaceful and vibrant. It is a harmonious community, its life sustained by the hard lessons of the past. The camera slowly descends, zooming in on the compound, then the baobab tree, and finally settles on the small, simple memorial stone and the surrounding 3 graves. The stone is now covered in fresh flowers and small offerings, not of fear, but of reverence and gratitude. It shows that the memory is actively maintained and honored with love. Please subscribe, share, like, and comment for more videos.